Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borak Athletes, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. I am your host, Mulchar, and I yet again have to apologise for the noise in the background, which is just 24 hours these days. On this episode, we are talking to Bryan Talbot, someone who I don't think it's an exaggeration to call his career unique. He's somebody who started off in underground comics in the 1970s, created Luther Arkwright, this dystopian sci-fi series that says a lot about it treads a lot of the same political pathways as Judge Dredd in parodying and criticising law and order, politics, and the general political landscape of the late 70s. He went on to work in mainstream comics, 2000 AD, on Nemesis the Warlock, and Judge Dredd, also working on DC Comics, Vertigo. But since 2000, he's established a reputation for creating original graphic novels, such as Tale of One Bad Rat, Alice in Sunderland, Grandville, which is the soon-to-be wrapped-up series that he created with anthropomorphic detectives. He is described as a graphic novelist. Now, this is a loaded term. Graphic novels as a concept, as a marketing term, as an industry term, is open to debate. But he's somebody who's really forged his own path in comics. So it was absolutely fascinating to be able to talk to somebody who I met way back, long before I started working at 2000 AD, when I was just a fan. It's really interesting to get his perspective on comic books, on his career, on what comic books can do, and also his role as an educator about comics. So it was wonderful to be able to chat away with Bryan. Before we do that, as always, thank you very much for all the feedback we've been getting on the podcast. Thrillcast@2000ad.com. If you've got suggestions, there's one or two that have come through, and yes, absolutely, we'll put those on the schedule for the future. We're going to continue all the way through lockdown with interviews. So I hope you're enjoying them. Please do help spread the word. Subscribe on iTunes or YouTube. We're also on Spotify, basically on the podcast provider of your choice. So without much further ado, let's crack on and have a chat with Bryan Talbot. Let's start off by talking about Grandville, and then kind of move back and go and talk about your early work in 2000 AD and everything. But let's just talk about now for a moment. You've Grandville is a project that has continued for quite some time. For those who haven't picked it up, do you want to explain the basic premise behind Grandville?
It's an anthropomorphic steampunk detective thriller, basically. So, which means it's detective thriller with animals. And the premise of the story is it's sort of set in an imaginary Belle Epoque. So there's a lot about Nouveau in it and stuff like that. And the premise is that Napoleon actually won the Napoleonic Wars, conquered the world more or less, and most of it. And in Europe, he had all the heads of state executed, and basically for the last 200 years, Britain's been under French rule, up to 23 years before the story starts, when after a long campaign of civil disobedience and anarchist bombings, they were begrudgingly given independence. So now it's like the Independent Socialist Republic of Britain. And it's still joined with France with the Channel Bridge, but there's this sort of uneven sort of relationship with it. I mean, France is the big power, and the idea is that Paris is actually the biggest city in the world, hence the nickname. It's called Grandville, which is that's where the idea for the name for the whole series came from.
I always get very confused because one of my old lecturers at university was called Grandville.
Really?
So every time I tried to say Grandville, I say Grandville.
I do actually call it Grandville, not Granville, you know, because I have this conceit in the story that, you know, everything's that they speak is in English, you know, but all because they've been occupied country for 200 years, they're all actually really speaking French, and it's translated. So any signs you see in the background or posters or anything, they're in French still. You know, I mean, I've got the, you know, the famous Skegness, his bracing poster. That's in the background of one scene. It says, Skegness c'est tellement vivifant, you know, stuff like that. And I've got a scene quite early on in the first one where they're investigating this murder and they're waiting for a train at this little local country station. Detective Inspector LeBrock, who's the protagonist, and his sidekick, Roderick Ratsey, Detective Sergeant Roderick Ratsey. They wait for a train back to London. And Roderick, who's a bit of a cross between Lord Peter Wimsey, Bertie Wooster, and Ratty from, you know, Wind in the Willows. And he says to LeBrock, he's a working class badger, you know. He says, I say, you know, these coves over there, what sort of language is that? What lingo is that? I've never heard that. And LeBrock says to him, oh, you've never heard it? It still is actually spoken in some of these little country villages. It's English. And at that point, the reader should go, oh my God, I've been reading French all this time.
I've always picked up from Grandville a very strong kind of critique of colonialism, which I guess is what you're talking about with the language, and also themes. And we'll get this. I'm sure we'll get into this more in as we chat. Themes of anti-authoritarianism and working class. Not just ideology, but also experience.
A lot of it's about the class system, you know. So the class system's still there. You know.
With something like Grandville, are these ideas foremost in your mind? Are these why you wanted to tell this story, or does the story come first and then you explore these ideas?
Yeah, well, I've been wanting to write a detective story for a while, and I think that came first. I didn't have a specific story in mind at all. But one day, if the book's handy, no, probably not. I have this book I had in the 70s about the early 19th century French illustrator called Jean-Ignace Isidore Gérard. And he used to do all these anthropomorphic illustrations with animals in the contemporary dress of the time. And his pen name, people knew him as J.J. Grandville. And I was just flicking through this book for some reason, and I've had it for decades. And I suddenly went, Grandville, you know, that could be the nickname for Paris in this alternative world where, well, yeah, that's what a story. Well, I want to do a detective story, right? And the story just wrote itself. It was incredible. I thought about it for a week. I mean, while I was working on Alice, I think it was, or something else. And at the end of a week, I just sat down here and typed the entire script in about 5 or 6 days. It just told itself. And the characters speaking, everything. Never usually happens like that. It just all came in this flood of inspiration. It was brilliant. It was like receiving dictation, you know. It was just like, oh yeah. I just did a basic outline of the plot, you know, basic structure, very basic, in about 5 minutes, and then just started typing. And that's the first time I've done a graphic novel without laboriously laying anything out, you know, no thumbnails, nothing, because that's how I used to approach it for years. Each page I'd break down all the panels, work on the dialogue at the same time in pencil, what's going to be in each panel. And this, for the very first time, I just skipped that process completely, went straight to script. And it's what I've done since then. Because it's great, because doing a graphic novel, it's a long slog. You know, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And anything that can save time, when you're working on that is a real bonus.
What was your reasoning behind anthropomorphizing animals rather than having human characters?
Well, because it was inspired by Grandville, by Isidore Gerard. If you just do a Google image search for Grandville, you'll find tons of his images. You know, that he's a fantastic illustrator, big influence on John Tenniel. And I was thinking about it. I thought, well, I like trying different things. And in my whole career, I'd never done an anthropomorphic story. And I thought, well, it's a chance to do an anthropomorphic story, see if I can do one, you know. And I did quite a bit of research, lots of pictures I picked up books with pictures of animals in. I bought all these little toys, these very realistic toys you can get by this German company. They're about that big, quite dear, they're about £3 or £4 each, but they're good for models, drawing from. But yeah, I'd never actually done one before. And I started looking into it, you know, the subject. I mean, people have been telling anthropomorphic stories as long as there's been people around. The earliest example of any piece of figurative art in the world is the Lion Man of the caves at Munchen in Germany. And this is at 40,000 years old. It's carved it from a mammoth tusk. It's about a foot high, and it's a human figure. They don't know whether it's a man or a woman, actually, not decided, but it's got lion's head. And there's lots of cave paintings with anthropomorphic characters on, and they go right through the Middle Ages, through fables and fairy tales, and they've always been there. Mythology, every world religion has animals in it, as anthropomorphic animals, especially the Egyptians. Practically all their gods were animals. There's Leda and the Swan and stuff like this in Greek mythology. Zeus was always changed into an animal. I mean, even the Bible, you have an anthropomorphic serpent in the Garden of Eden. You know, I mean, went through the Middle Ages right to present day. I mean, I do actually say I do a talk where I tell the history of anthropomorphic characters. So I do actually know this.
I'm interested in what this means for you in terms of the story that you want to tell, and whether it allows you to talk to the audience in a different way that you would if the characters were human.
I suppose so. Yeah. I'm not analysed exactly. I've tried to think, why do people like anthropomorphic stories? I don't know. I mean, for me, it was a chance to go back to my childhood, really, because, you know, I was brought up on Rupert the Bear and things like this, and classic British comic characters who were animals, like Leo Baxendale's The Three Bears and things like that. I do actually give a cameo role in Grandville. Also in Grandville, the first book, the murder that starts off the story is in Nutwood. It's actually in Rupert Bear's village of Nutwood. So it's nice. It's fun to be able to play with that. But really, I mean, Grandville, it's just a huge homage to detective stories and crime fiction. I mean, everything from Sherlock Holmes to Philip Marlowe, and I mean, Fantomas, and all sorts of, even down to, you know, references to the Saint, or, you know, I mean, all sorts of detective fiction are sort of referenced somewhere in there.
Has turned out how you intended it to, or has it been something that you've enjoyed as you've been going along, so more has occurred to you that you want to do?
Well, exactly, yeah. I mean, my first idea was a one-off story. And by the end of the first one, I thought, well, I mean, it's hard work drawing it. It used to take about 3 or 4 days to do a page of artwork, including a full day doing the computer colouring, you know. But it was so fun writing these things and coming up with the ideas for the story. I thought, well, I'd like to do another one. And by the time I was halfway through scripting that, I'd already got ideas for another half dozen. And I decided to stop it at 5. So I won't do any more now. basically because they take too long. It takes well over a year to do a book. And the last one, the fifth one, Force Majeure, it was 166 pages. So it was a lot longer than the others, which are all about 96 pages each. And so I finished on, I thought, that's a great, I'm not going to better this story because I thought it was an ideal detective story, detective thriller story, lots of action in it, you know. And I thought I'll end on a high note rather than keep on doing them and, you know, perhaps have the quality tail off. But it was good because the fifth one actually ends a story out that's been building from the first volume. So it was a good place to end it, even though they're all standalone stories. You can read them in any order, basically. But there is actually a story out that goes through.
You mentioned the kind of things that you were reading when you were a kid. So I think that's an ideal moment to talk a little bit about your own origin story. Because you're originally from Wigan.
That's right.
You're a grammar school boy.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about your early years in terms of what you were reading and what you were doing, because one of the things that I'm most fascinated by is how is the influence of early reading on people's subsequent careers. I mean, you've already name checked like Rupert the Bear and things like that. So what was it like in Wigan for a young Bryan growing up?
I was quite shy till I was about teenager, till I was mid-teenager, and so I did read a lot. I read a lot of comics, Beano, Dandy, all that stuff. Then I discovered DC comics in the 50s and later Marvel comics, and you know I was into horror movies for quite a while, and I used to get creepy and eerie, and they had comics in sometimes. I'm getting it wrong way around. I mean, the famous Monster Film, which is about movies and monsters and things. They had this experiment where they tried running a couple of comic strips, which were beautifully drawn, adaptations of like Hammer movies. And because these were quite popular, they started Creepy and Eerie off, which they're a bit like a rerun of the same idea of Creepy and Eerie, like Creepy and Eerie, EC comics in the 50s, you know, with the story host who introduced the stories and had lots of alliteration and the way he spoke and had a joke at the end of the story. And they're all drawn by different artists. And so one issue, there was Steve Ditko did a story called Collector's Edition. And it just blew my mind. I thought, wow, that's amazing. I didn't realize that the comic form was, you know, capable of doing something like that, because it was really experimental and it was a beautiful sort of cross-hatching technique. And he did all sorts of strange things with the panels, like having a wide panel at the bottom of each page it was like a pair of eyes staring out. And throughout the story, they close and close and close until the next to the last page. Well, the last page, they've closed, and there's a drip of blood running down the eye. And on the last page, everything sort of comes together, and there's a bit where the whole panel's in the middle splinter, and each one's an aspect of the same moment, what's happening. You can actually read it online. You can find it online, collected edition, the whole strip. But I went, wow, that's amazing. And I really started to get seriously interested in comics then. I'd still no idea I'd end up actually writing and drawing them, but it made me think again about comics. But I used to read a lot of stuff, you know. I think the first actually adult novel I read was Christmas Carol. It's quite a small one, you know, by Dickens. And as I said, I was into horror fiction. So when I was about 12, I actually struggled all the way through Frankenstein, which was really tough read. Dracula was a bit easier, but yeah, when I was a teenager, I used to read all sorts of things like Dennis Wheatley and stuff like that, lots of magical stuff.
Your dad was a miner and your mum was a hairdresser, I believe.
Yeah, well, he was a miner when he started before the war, when he was a teenager. And then when he came back, he was a sailor during the war. He was a sailor longer than he was a miner. And when he came back, he was trained as a carpenter, and he went to work for the power station. So that's where he worked for the rest of his life, well, till he retired.
I mean, that's kind of solid, kind of working class Wigan background.
Oh yeah.
What did your parents think about your interest in drawing and comics? Because you started drawing quite early, didn't you?
Yeah. I used to draw and make my own comics when I was little, but it's strange because they never tried to dissuade me from going into a career of art. The other things I was good at school was really English and art. And when I said, I want to do something with art, I don't know what, they never discouraged me. But yeah, I mean, I was the first person from our family, including cousins and things like that, to go into higher education. And it wasn't just my dad was a miner. It was two mining families, both sets of grandparents. The granddads were miners, and their fathers before them, I should think. But yeah, I don't know why that was. I know my dad used to. I never saw any, but apparently my dad used to do watercolor paintings when he was younger, and he sort of gave it up and never continued again. Perhaps that's why.
And you went to Wigan Grammar School, Wigan School of Art. I've seen an interview with you where you said you'd already kind of decided that comics were your thing by the time that you were applying to go to art college, but
Fine art college, yeah.
But it wasn't really something that was acceptable to do at that kind of art college in those days.
No, I turned up for these interviews at fine art colleges, the portfolio of abstract art, because that's what you were forced to do at that point. Figurative art was banned more or less in the foundation course. But I thought I'd got this grand idea of doing what we'd now call a graphic novel, this fantasy story I'd been working on. And I thought, well, it'd make a university project, wouldn't it? I could work on it for the 3 years. So that went down like a lead balloon at the interviews, for fine art college, and I didn't get on anywhere. And that's why I ended up doing a graphic design course in Preston. And even I went along to the interview for that, and they looked through a portfolio. They were looking at these abstract things and shaking their heads and going, "What's this shit?" And then they said, "What's these?" And I said, "Oh, there's some illustrations I've done for a Tolkien Society fanzine, the first published illustrations." And they said, "Oh, these are all right, start on Monday." And that's how I got on a 3-year graphic design course. I think they had one place left. And it was the week before they were looking to fill it. Because I'd gone from a 3, earliest the interviews at the beginning of summer to get on a fine art course for September, failed miserably. So me and Mary, we went down to London and stayed with her brother for 3 months and just hung out in London. And when we came back to Wigan, it was a week before the colleges were due to start. I still hadn't found somewhere, and I think Mary's mum had seen this advert in the Guardian or something. We still got one place left for graphic design at Preston, so I applied for it and got it. Which was a bad choice actually, because when I got there, I discovered there was no illustration taught at all on the course. None. No illustration tutors, no live classes, nothing. It was all very strongly typographically based, the Preston course. So I did learn about layout and stuff like that, and photography.
Well, I was going to ask whether you felt that you'd got anything useful out of the course, but I guess that answers that question.
I learned how to use tactile pens and things like that. But by the end of it, I knew I didn't want to work in advertising. I thought, no, that was horrible. I hated it, the graphic design course. And so, I still needed a job. I had a family to support by this point. And most of my friends from college, they just went down to London or big cities where there were graphic design studios. Well, there was one in Preston. And one of my friends from college, he went there, and he got some part-time work there, so I was basically unemployed, but if somebody was off sick or on holiday, they'd get in touch and I'd go in and fill in, for the but I hated working in graphic design. So meanwhile, I'd started trying to teach myself to draw. I've been drawing all my life, but it wasn't that good. So I was going for every week. I'd go to the local library, and I'd be getting books out on anatomy, perspective, light and shade, stuff like that. Practicing with them.
You mentioned that your first published illustrations appeared in the British Tolkien Society magazine. I mean, that suggests to me that you were into that kind of 1970s culture of fantasy art and all this, that, and the other. As you said, you had a family to support. How conscious were you of pathways into doing comics, or was it very much the kind of, look, I'm teaching myself how to draw, I just need some work, just some illustration work? How conscious were you of that?
I still didn't know I was going to end up drawing comics for a living. Never occurred to me. But I had started, I was really into underground comics at the time, Robert Crumb and Gilbert Sheldon, people like this. And I'd started drawing this underground comic when I was at college for my own amusement, basically. I think I'd done about 3 pages. I still had no idea what the story was going to be. And a year or two before, I'd been in London and met this guy called Lee Harris, who ran a shop in Portobello Road called Alchemy, his head shop. And I think it was the first head shop in the country, actually. And it only actually closed about a year or two ago. He went to his closing party. And I showed him some artwork because I took some down for Cosmic Comics. It was still going at the time. I did a 1-page story, which I took down and tried to sell it. And Felix Dennis, remember Felix Dennis, the big publisher, before it became massive. It was one of those 3, And he accepted the strip, actually. And that was the issue that never came out. It was issue 18. They folded after that. So I never got the artwork back. I never got paid anything. But meanwhile, I'd showed this to Lee, and I said, I've got an idea for a longer comic. And he just said, well, if you ever do it, I'll publish it. I mean, like that. He never published a comic before in his life. He published some leaflets and this, that, and the other. But so when I was at college, after I'd finished college, I was unemployed. I thought, well, I was applying for jobs as a dustman and all sorts of things. I mean, I thought, well, I might as well do this comic that Lee said he'd publish. It took me about 6 months to do 20 pages, and I finished and hitched down to London because I'm so broke. Hitched down 200 miles to London, found Lee. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, because it's 2 years or something, 3 years since I've seen him. And I said, do you remember if I did a comic, you said you'd publish it? And he said, no. And I just, anyway, he looked at it and he spent about an hour looking through it. And he said, at the end of the hour, he said, right, let's go and find a printer. And that's how my first comic got published, Brainstorm, the first Brainstorm comic. And when it came out, Lee said, we best get on with the next one. So we ended up doing 6 altogether. One of them was anthology, well, 2 of them were anthologies with other artists in, but the other 4 were me.
You mentioned there about the underground comics, about the underground culture at the time, and I'm very curious because I suppose these days we'd call the kind of thing you were doing like DIY comics. So you're putting it together, it's going out from a very, very small press. But I'm keen to learn about your memories of the underground scene as it was, and what underground meant to you as somebody who just decided he wanted to make some comics. Yeah,
well, I just loved underground comics, and I came in on the tail end of them. Nasty Tales and Cosmic Comics, they were like the 2 last big underground comics before mine. And mine was like right at the end. Mine was, and also Hunt was doing comics as well. Hunt Emerson with the Birmingham Arts Lab. 75 Brainstorm came out. It was about the end of British underground comics, really. But yeah, as opposed to like small press comics, which I suppose the Birmingham Arts Lab ones were, or even the small press today, I mean, Brainstorm actually sold a lot. I mean, we're talking about 12,000 copies of each issue. Because what you don't have today, which you had then, I mean, now there's basically a monopoly, you know, there's Smiths and Menzies, whatever, and yeah, you know, if they don't accept you, you don't get distributed, basically. And apparently, from what I hear, you have to pay them £20,000 to take your title in the first place. Back then, there was loads of little tiny independent distributors who distribute anything. I mean, and we were distributed by Moore Harness, who, I mean, they mainly distributed cheap soft porn magazines, you know, and they also distributed Oz and IT and underground magazines. So Lee approached them and said, yeah, because they'd take anything. And they got brainstorming to news agents all over the country. Same thing happened with Near Myths when we started doing Near Myths in the late 70s, where Luther Arkwright first started running. That was in corner shops all over Great Britain. It's great being able to get that distribution like that, which is something that people can't do now. You know, it's destroying the comic industry.
I guess that this was the 70s was the time of kind of underground, quite esoteric. You know, I mean, Footy and Time started in 73, so there's a lot of interest around an underground that represents alternative views. In terms of where you sat in this, say, you know, it was at the tail end of the underground scene. Were you, how to phrase this? Were you keen to be a part of a scene, or was it just you want to do your own thing? You know, how much were you conscious of plugging into an existing culture?
Well, I did gradually. I mean, in 1976, Hunt, along with Chris Welch, they organised the first convention of alternative comics in Birmingham, and the following year they had the second one, which was in London. It was even bigger. So yeah, suddenly there was all these people I knew in that sort of scene. I'd also started going to, you know, comic marts and things like that. I met Des Skin in about 73 at a mart in Liverpool, I think, one of Trev Hughes' comic marts, which he had for years. I don't know if he still does them, but and I'd started contributing covers and things to comic fanzines, such as Fantasy Advertiser and Comics Unlimited and things like this. So I was sort of starting to make these connections, but yeah, it was only while I was working on these Brainstorm comics I thought, oh, perhaps I could actually make a living at this. You know, because the first two I just sort of did, and then the third one, I sort of thinking a bit more of it. And I actually wanted to finish the third one very quickly, because even though it took me a long time, because the next one I did, which was the last Brainstorm comics, which is called Amazing Rock and Roll Adventures, I had a great idea for that. I really wanted to get on with it. It was about Earth being invaded by aliens through rock music. And it was a basically detective story, but the hero was a freelance rock reporter with an MO that was like a private dick. You know, he used to wear trilby and things. But it was the end of that Brainstorm thing that people started asking me for stuff rather than me doing things. And I started to get asked more and more to contribute strips to places. But it took till about 1980 before I could actually go. 81, I think, I finally went self-employed.
Looking back with something like Brainstorm, it was an influence on people like Alan Moore, even all the way through to people like Grant Morrison. Do you see yourself? Are you able to see yourself evolving at that moment? That it wasn't just here's what I want to do. And this is it, but that you were changing and growing, perhaps in confidence in what you wanted to do and what you wanted to say.
Yes, I suppose so. I was still still learning, you know. I mean, it was only when I said I had this idea to do this, what we now call a graphic novel, some while ago. It all came from a news item in Castle of Frankenstein, which is a horror magazine, which was announcing, there was a little announcement saying, oh, that somebody's adapting Poul Anderson's The Broken Sword, which is a fantasy novel, as a comic. And I thought, wow, what a brilliant idea. A comic, an entire novel in comic form. That was great. And this sort of stuck with me. And anyway, while I was doing brainstorm, I started thinking about this Luther Arkwright character. In fact, I did a short Luther Arkwright strip in the third brainstorm, but it was just a silly throwaway strip. And I only started thinking more seriously after that. And I plotted out this long story, you know, adult science fiction story, basically, science fiction adventure story. And then right when brainstorm was finishing, the Rob King, who ran the science fiction bookshop in Edinburgh, he got in touch, said, oh, I'm starting this magazine called Near Myths. Would you like to contribute to it? And it was the sort of magazine I've been reading. I mean, Star Reach was coming out in America, and Metal Hurlant started coming out in France. They were both adult science fiction comics, and that's what he wanted to do. Or his was a lot more low budget. But yeah, he said, do you want to contribute to that? So I started contributing with Arkwright to it in installments. And that's how it started being published. But it was only doing Luther Arkwright, to answer your question. I actually felt that was like my apprenticeship. I think the Brainstorm comics are probably the apprenticeship in the medium. I think Arkwright one was more like doing a PhD, you know. But I really wanted to, you know, I put everything I had into it. It was very experimental, you know. I was trying to do things that hadn't been done before, because I could read things in novels or see things in films. I think I can see them there. Why can I not see these in comics? I mean, people might forget and not know, but I mean, American superhero comics at that time, they were pretty awful. They were as bland as anything. You used to see a comic from the 70s. You know, if somebody was shot, there was no blood, nobody swore, nobody had sex. You know, I think Stranko was censored for trying to have a scene where a sex scene was suggested, you know. And I thought, well, I'm going to get all this into Arkwright. So I did. I had people being sick and swearing and all sorts of things. And I thought, you know, because you see these in films, you know, when somebody was shot in Arkwright, they didn't just fall over, their head blew off. You know, I mean, and also I wanted to put a good story around it. So I have all these shocking things. I was still trying to be an adult story that would shock and I don't know, affect people. You know, it was influenced by things like Straw Dogs, you know, Sam Peckinpah, and Sergio Leone films, and The Godfather was a big influence on it.
I'm very interested in Luther Arkwright. I've read it a long time ago. I've got the new edition on order at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
What, the one with the Heart of Empire and the same?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I mean, there's a lot to say about Luther Arkwright. One of the things I did want to pick on is the fact that you, and this relates to something that we talked about right at the beginning. You chose a Cromwellian dystopia to set it in, and for me that links nicely forwards to choosing a Napoleonic dystopian future,
right, yeah.
with Grandville, and I that for me bookends your career, that the sense of an analysis of or a critique of nationalism, of dystopia, of authoritarianism, of I guess a distrust of those who are singularly minded, shall we say, you know, that kind of fascistic nature of the strong man. And I wondered if in the 1970s you were coming from the same direction as people like Pat Mills were in a rejection of the growing strength of the right in British politics.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, bear in mind that me and Alan Moore, we grew up after the Second World War. We grew up with the Second World War. It hadn't finished, it hadn't been finished 10 years. And so we grew up with the spectre of Hitler and Nazism, and we knew what it did, we knew what fascism was like. And then the 1970s, you saw the rise of the right wing with Thatcher coming to power, and the National Front marching openly on the street. And I think at the time I was volunteering to do work for the local anti-Nazi League group. And a lot of Arkwright is very much a reaction against this an anti-fascist sort of story. And it comes, V Vendetta comes from exactly the same place a little later. I've talked to Alan about this at the time. we all thought we're in for the 30-year Reich, the 300-year Reich, with Thatcher coming to power. It was a scary time. The thing is, it's happening now. It's exactly the same thing happening now. And the new Luther Arkwright, which I'm actually working on, it's going back to this original idea. It's very anti-nationalistic, and I don't want to speak too much about it because it's not going to be published for about a year or two, because I'm still working on it. But I'm sort of going back to the original. I'm even going back to the original sort of cross-hatching sort of style, which is what Pat Mills liked for Nemesis. Why he asked me to do the Nemesis story, because he wanted this like historical patina for the Nemesis story. In fact, when he asked me to draw Torquemada without a mask, he said to me, I want him to look like General Standish in your Luther Arkwright story, which is why he's got looks like he does.
We'll come on to talk about Nemesis in a minute, because that is obviously for the 2000 AD podcast, it's a very important subject to cover. Just coming back to Luther Arkwright, it's interesting that you mentioned V for Vendetta, which is entirely right. Comes from the same space, but it's where you reach back to. You've got this Cromwellian dystopia, but steampunk, which is a style that an aesthetic that has grown over the following decades. But Luther Arkwright is one of the earliest examples.
Well, I think it is the first steampunk graphic novel. This is years before the term was coined. I think we used to call it retro science fiction. I think at the time,
when Moore and David Lloyd were doing V for Vendetta, they reached back to the war years, so a kind of almost Orwellian phase of kind of wartime austerity, whereas you reach back to Victoriana, to empire, to notions of Britishness from the previous century, and I'm wondering how much that is a product of the world you grew up in, that kind of post-war northern landscape of big works, of big industry, a sense of connection with the past, and how that influenced the way,
especially in Wigan, because it was a very strongly royalist town in the Civil War, and one of the last battles of the Civil War was fought in Wigan, the Battle of Wigan Lane, which was sort of massacre of royalists by Roundhead ambush, basically, called infiltrad, whatever. It's whether you line up people and when they're marching past you, suddenly open fire, and from what I can remember. But so you can imagine it got Civil War got taught in schools quite a lot in Wigan, in junior schools. We were all aware of the Civil War, so I think that's where the idea of this Cromwellian alternative world came from. But the Victorian came in. I've always been into it for some reason or other. I mean, I've always loved the Sherlock Holmes stories. And when I was from about 12 onwards, I mean, in the 60s, for quite a while, suddenly Victoriana were extremely cool. You know, there were TV series like Adam Adamant, who was this Victorian adventurer, was frozen in time and brought back to swinging London, you know, woke up in swinging London, which I used to like. And there are films like Charge of Light Brigade, in the Wrong Box, a lot of these Victorian films, Zulu and stuff like that. There was a new TV series based on Holmes. But yeah, it became very fashionable. I mean, the Beatles on front Sgt. Pepper's, they were in, you know, the old psychedelic Edwardian military uniforms. You know, Jimi Hendrix and Mick Jagger were in old hussars jackets on stage. I mean, it was very trendy for a while. And so I grew up thinking, oh, it's really cool, you know. And I don't know, that sort of era, it's got something about it. I mean, there's a lot of inequality there and lots of bad things about it. But as you said, the engineering works and things like that were incredible. I mean, I grew up with the steam trains, and you can compare, especially with a kid getting off a steam train, these massive, huge, I mean, really massive pieces of work they were. And when they used to stop at the station, they used to let all the steam out, and it was like a fire-breathing dragon. It just covered all the platform and see you walking out through steam, really loud. And it's a big monster. I mean, compare that to a modern electrical train. There's no contest, you know. It's
even growing up in Blackburn in the 1980s, you know, I was surrounded by the relics of the Industrial Revolution. You know, pretty much all we were taught about was the Industrial Revolution. So it's kind of, you're surrounded by it in that part of Lancashire, really, aren't you?
Well, yeah. I mean, when I was in Preston, when I living in Preston, and I was actually living not a quarter of a mile from the house where Richard Arkwright set up the steam loom. He was one of the fathers of the Industrial Revolution, and I use his name for, you know, Arkwright's last name. But yeah, this is the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, Lancashire.
With Luther Arkwright, I mean, like I said, there's so much you can get into with the symbolism and the politics of it all and everything. But what was the story that you were trying to tell at the time?
I was trying to tell an intelligent science fiction story that was worth an adult's time to read, you know, because the science fiction stories of the time in comics, they were all sort of, you know, ray guns and jetpacks and all this sort of stuff. And I wanted to do more like a New Worlds sort of science fiction story that was social resonances and serious things, you know, a story that had, you know, things that adults are interested in, you know, like sex, religion, philosophy, politics, you know. I probably was trying to be too ambitious, I don't know, but it's never been out of print since it first it started appearing in print in 78, and it's appeared in lots of countries and still going. So, you know, there's a bit of news about that. I mean, I don't know if you know, a few years ago there was an audio drama of The Adventures of Luther Arkwright with David Tennant playing in the part of Arkwright. Well, they're actually working on the sequel now. They're working on Heart of Empire. And I've heard that David Tennant's already recorded his bits from them. I don't know if there's anything to do with me actually meeting him last year at a Neil Gaiman thing to promote Good Omens, and backstage, and Neil introduced me to David Tennant, who's a lovely guy. And I said, "Oh, I remember you've done played one of my characters." And he said, "Who?" And I told him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember." And I said, "Well, they do have the script for the next one, you know." And apparently they've been trying to get him to get some time to do it for ages. He's been so busy. He's not been so much in demand. But the thing is, during this lockdown, he's been short of work because, you know, and what he could do was go into the studio alone and record his bits. So we've actually got David Tennant on the new one when it comes out.
Every cloud is a silver lining. And
Oh yeah.
With Luther Arkwright, I mean, people bring up the fact that it was collected and out around about the same time as When the Wind Blows, but it predates the publication of it predates it by 4 years in serialized form. One of the things that I'm most fascinated about with your career is how so many people who've gone on to have a big impact in certainly in British comics through 2000 AD and then American comics did so by entering the standard model, which was, you know, there's DC Thompson and there's IPC, and you go and work for one of them and you learn how to do your job, and then you can go off and do your own thing. But your career is so different to that, because you forged your own path and started on the path to being essentially a graphic novelist, for want of a better phrase, so early on. Before graphic novels were even really a thing, you kind of had your eye on that as a form that you wanted to use. And then,
sorry,
I was going to ask whether it was something you were conscious of at the time, that you know what, I want to do these big overarching stories in a form that isn't serialized once a week and has to have a cliffhanger every 6 pages.
Yeah, probably. I mean, the very first episode of Luther Arkwright came out in October '78, which was actually the same month that A Contract with God was published in America, which is usually thought of as the first graphic novel, because it was the first comic marketed as that. And I mean, all graphics, it's just a marketing term, graphic novel. It just means comics in book form. That's all it means. You can have anthologies, you can have a reportage, you can have all sorts of things. But yeah, in the early 80s, I remember I gave a talk several times with a slideshow and talk in libraries and some universities and things. And it was that history of comics. I was basically trying to be evangelistic about comics and trying to get people to read comics. I was talking about the history of comics. And it finished with, it led up to the fact that, and the future is the graphic novel. This is in the 80s. And one of those talks, I gave at Richmond University when Dave McKean was a student there. So I wonder if I'm responsible for him going into comics. But because he's done some great graphic novels. But yeah, I mean, it took me a while. I mean, to get around to doing the second one, but I had to finish off Luther Arkwright first. And it was actually, we've not got to this bit yet, but working for 2000 AD, it was actually a big step after working with them for 5 years to make the decision to actually leave 2000 AD so I could go back and finish the Arkwright story. And I had to think long and hard about that.
Well, let's move on to talk about Nemesis, because your work on Nemesis was the first Nemesis that I was introduced to through Best of 2000 AD Monthly. I think it was the Black Hole, the not the Black Hole story, because that was other people, but the Nemesis stuff about the ABC warriors. So it was post Gothic Empire.
Post Gothic Empire.
Yes, yeah. But Pat has a long history of seeing artists he likes and go, you know what, this is the artist I want on this. Was it literally a case of suddenly there's a phone call from Pat Mills saying I want you to work on Nemesis, or was there a different way that you got into working for 2000 AD?
I think it was actually a phone call from Steve McManus, but Pat had asked for me, who was Tharg at the time, of course. No, I first met Pat in the early 80s at a Society of Strip Illustration meeting in London. And he was talking, one of the first things he said was, I really love Luther Arkwright. This, and we're talking about this retro science fiction. He said, I'd love to do a retro science fiction story with you for 2000 AD. And I went, 2000 AD, it's cutting edge of comics at the time, and it was, I'd have done anything to work on it. And I said, yeah, sure, I'd be interested in that. And then I didn't hear anything from him. And this was a few years later. So I've discovered the way that Pat works is actually, he very often gets an idea for something, like he got the idea for the Gothic Empire one. But then he thought, well, I've got to tell the story that leads up to this. So he actually did the first 2 books before it. And I suppose I was lucky after the first 2. So I think this original idea for a retro science fiction story, that's what became of it, the Gothic Empire. But we only ended up doing it a few years later. And it was because then in 83, I think it was, Kevin started to go off to work for America. He stopped working for 2000 AD and was working for DC Comics. So they needed an artist. And of course, because I'd, you know, he knew my work on Arkwright, Pat asked for me. So that was great. I think I'd already gone self-employed because before then I was doing I've managed to get work doing lots of illustration work, which was a bit silly because that enabled me to go self-employed. I did one illustration for a magazine called Flexipop. I don't know if you remember it. It used to have a plastic floppy record on the front. And they said, can you do this picture of Adamant? And I said, who's Adamant? And it's before he was famous. And I was actually doing some part-time teaching at the time. And so I asked the students, everybody to Adamant? And a few of them were, and they brought in these Adamant fanzines and things and lent some records. So I did this illustration. It got published, the magazine came out, and that month he broke. He went massive in the very same month. And people wanted Adamant illustrations for these poster magazines and things like that. And they saw this Flexipop thing and they thought, oh, he must be the Adamant artist. So for about a year, I was practically doing nothing else but Adamant illustrations and logos, airbrush logos, you know, Adamant's birthday party and all sorts of things. But it was the first time, I was actually making money for the first time. I was making lots of money, so I actually went self-employed. And that's been self-employed ever since. But yeah, about the end of this, as Adamant was tailing off, Pat came along with this offer of doing 2000, which was great. I mean, I had a strip in Sounds magazine, I don't know, Sounds Music magazine. I used to have a strip in that, which I used to write and draw once a month. But yeah, suddenly I found myself working to weekly deadlines, you know, with this, with 2000, which was good discipline, really. I also learned a lot reading Pat's scripts, because he's a very good, extremely good comic writer.
Your style at the time was a continuation of the stuff that you've been doing with Luther Arkwright. Very heavy on the hatching, as you said. Very gothic. How did you come to develop this style? Because it I mean, certainly from my consciousness when I was younger, you know, it just kind of seems to arrive in of itself, but it was a product of the work that you've been doing. In terms of how you were putting stuff together, in terms of the influences you were drawing on for something like Nemesis, was it very much, you know, this is the Gothic Empire, so I'm going to reference lots of nice kind of Victoriana, lots of kind of dark satanic mills and a bit
it was in the script. It's what Pat wanted, you know. I mean, the style I did Luther Arkwright in was quite deliberate, because I didn't want it to look like the sort of shorthand American comic style. I wanted it to look like something adults might be interested in looking at. You know, I wanted it to be illustration quality artwork. And I was very influenced by, you know, the prints of William Hogarth, you know, the 19th century illustrator, and the Gustave Doré as well, the French illustrator, both of whom used this very intense cross-hatch style. Most people like Arthur Rackham and British book illustrators like that. So yeah, that's where the cross-hatching style came from. It does take a long time.
Well, I was just about to ask whether there ever came a point when you regretted your choice of style.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, one of the pages in Luther Arkwright took 3 solid days to ink. I mean, that's just the all day. I mean, it's a bit like knitting. You can spend about 2 hours cross-hatching so that you've covered a bit about that much, It's, it's incredibly time-consuming.
I guess
I'm doing it now, actually, with this new one, but I've sort of managed to speed it up a bit somehow.
I was about to say, I guess with Nemesis, it was kind of the perfect overlap of the things that you'd been experimenting in with Luther Arkwright. It's kind of quite serendipitous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why Pat chose me, so I don't think it's that, that's strange. But yeah, he gave me some great scenes to draw, like this fantastic train to go through the jungle on monorails, which looks like Kew Gardens, things like that. The tower to the moon, just like the Eiffel Tower at the base that goes to the brick moon, all this sort of stuff. Some great stuff to draw. I wish I'd kept a lot of that artwork. I've got 1 page of. I may have 2 pages, but I've got a cover of Luther Arkwright, of Nemesis. It's on hold at the moment because of the epidemic, but it's been touring the world in a science fiction, huge science fiction exhibition. It's been in about 6 capitals so far. It's going on. It's a 3-year tour. It's supposed to be, and it's insured for $5,000 or something. This cover, and at the time I was still a bit broke, and I sold a lot of the pages for like £25, £35, and everything. Then now I see them going for a few thousand. It's some of them, but needed the money at the time to buy kids' shoes and things like that.
But your take on Nemesis felt like a lot more like for me as a kid, much more like an action hero. It's like he's got a leather jacket on, and it was different to Kevin O'Neill's take, which was much more of a mythic kind of almost like a knight in armor feel. But with yours, it felt very punky. It felt very 1980s.
Yeah, well, especially after that. I mean, with the first one, I felt I had to sort of follow Kevin's style a bit. I didn't follow the drawing style, but the way he was dressed and everything. And when Pat said, right, we're going to do another story, and it was a lot more sort of straight science fiction rather than steampunk, I thought, well, I don't need to do all this cross-hatching now. I can do a more slicker style. No, because I've always tried to adapt the style to suit the story, and so I was doing a lot of it with a brush, and it was a lot more sort of science fiction style. And I also thought, well, I can draw his costume however I like. So I started giving this, I suppose it was influenced by things like Mad Max around before, and things like that, which was, of course, designed by Brendan McCarthy, and it was a time then, the young New Romantics. So I gave Purity a makeover, a New Romantic makeover. I mean, before she wasn't in the stories very much before, I don't think, but so I designed her costume, and I think I redesigned it a couple of times during the stories. But yeah, they were more slicker, straightforward ones. I dug out a couple of things before this is out of a cupboard of mine. I mean, look at this here.
Oh, wow.
That's this comes to mind.
Do you want to explain where that's from?
Well, have you heard of Tony Luke? You know Tony Luke, who died a few years ago. Poor Tony. I used to see him quite a lot. He used to live in Manchester, I think, and he used to go up to Preston when we had the SF group meetings. And he used to make models and animated films and all sorts of things. And I remember him saying to me, I wouldn't mind a page of... I'd done this double-page spread with Saturnus being blasted by these Terminators, whatever, and big double-page spread. He said, I'd love to buy that off you. I said, I don't think I can afford it. And I said, tell you what, do me a model of Nemesis and I'll swap it. So he got the page, the double-page spread, and I got this. which usually sits in a cupboard over there, in the little display cupboard.
He did an animation of Nemesis, didn't he?
That's right. Yes, he did. Yeah.
He's always one of those characters which works perfectly on the comic page, and then you think about putting it on the screen, and you think, how the hell are they going to make this work? Yeah.
It will be strange. Yeah. I also found this, which was I don't remember that.
Oh, blimey, yes, yeah, the old game.
Yeah, Commodore 64 game or something. That's it's the artworks from the cover I did for the first Titan collection of Nemesis.
Looking back on this phase of your career with Nemesis, I mean, you mentioned about how it helped teach you, give you a certain degree of discipline. You had to have a certain degree of discipline because of the schedule. How influential is that period on 2000 AD? Because you did Judge Dredd as well. How influential has it been on your subsequent career, do you think?
I think quite a lot. I mean, it did sort of make my name in certain circles doing Nemesis. A lot of people who hadn't heard of me before, by the end of it, they knew who I was. I mean, at this time, 2000 AD was selling 120,000 copies a week. I mean, rock solid circulation they had. And when I went back, when we started doing Luther Arkwright again, after I finished my run on Nemesis, I did it came out in a 9-issue comic format, as well as 3 softback books. But I did a tour. Lasted about 8 weeks, a UK tour. So I was in about 3 or 4 shops a week, mainly at weekends, sometimes up to 5 shops. And the queues were enormous. They were around the block. They were huge. Never had such big queues for signings since then. But that was because of 2000 AD. And I also made an agreement. I can't remember what they got in return, but Steve McManus let us have a full-page ad in 2000 for the tour. So as well as being advertised on the back of the first or second Arkwright comic, it was also advertised there and other places. So we got a lot of people turning up.
I'm curious because, like I said, your path had been very different to, say, other people who had gone into comics around about the same time. Having had this time in, for want of a better phrase, commercial comic, mainstream comics, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but you went on to do some stuff with American comics. Do you feel that this pushed you towards wanting to do more of your own stuff in kind of graphic novel form, or was this just part of your evolution over this period? How did you react to working commercially?
It was a very high pressure thing. I mean, you didn't have to do a chapter a week because they give you, so I think the first one, it was nearly 20 chapters, something like that. So I had to have about 12 finished before they started running the first one. And then it was very hard. So I for most of that 5 years, I was working till about 2 in the morning, most nights. It was very high pressured. But in the early 80s, I started getting into the idea of finding out about European comic market, especially the one in France, and the hardback albums they did. And I was hearing how some of these artists, were making a fortune because they owned the copyright on their own characters. The comic could be published in one country to be published in another one, and they get royalties from that, and they get rather than at the time. I think 2008 was just work for hire, and once you got paid, that was it. I mean, I know Igor Goldkind had some sort of hand in trying to get it changed, and he got it changed, so we actually started getting royalties eventually for the 2000 AD stuff. But yeah, that sort of appealed to me, to be able to own the copyright on the material, and it'd be completely mine. I'd already started working on. I'd got the idea, and I was researching stuff for what became the next graphic novel, which is The Tale of One Bad Rat. And immediately I got this Batman story out of the way. I started work on that. I had to find a publisher first for it, before, and I did that while I was working on Batman. But it's very hard to sell. It's very hard to find a publisher for it. I mean, it's before now in graphic novels, a lot of mainstream publishers do graphic novels. You can do a graphic novel about any subject. I mean, it was very rare back then in the early 90s, 91, 92, whatever. To have it. I mean, the subject is about psychological after effects of child sexual abuse. I mean, you'd had, Mouse by Art Spiegelman out, a couple of things like that, but not really. It wasn't a big industry like it is now. And I sent the proposal for Bad Rat to every single publisher of illustrated books in Britain, along with a sample illustration, this full synopsis. None of them, well, most of them replied saying no thanks. Some of them just sent the proposal back. I mean, they'd read the covering letter. I think they'd read the word comics and gone, nope. Because some of these proposals, they weren't even open. You could tell the pages were still stuck together, And I put them in a little plastic folder. So I eventually I asked Mike Richardson, Dark Horse, who did the American edition of the Luther Arkwright comic. And to his credit, he published it. I think it was quite brave of him at the time, because it wasn't a superhero title like the rest of the things he did. It was... So that was the next year or two of my life working on Bad Rat.
Considering what had happened in the 1980s, the graphic novel form had, for want of a better phrase, begun. People were writing about how important Mouse was, about how important Watchmen was, and to then have a situation where it's difficult for an established creator to do a graphic novel that hasn't been serialized somewhere else. Do you think that, to a certain extent, that publishing didn't really learn from the fad for graphic novels in the 1980s? That it just wanted stuff that it could repackage rather than original graphic novels?
I suppose so. I don't know. I mean, that boom didn't last because although there was, as you say, there was Watchmen, the Dark Knight, Mouse, handful of others. That's it. That was it at the time. I can remember there's about one or two graphic novels being published a year at that time, until Marvel and DC jumped on the bandwagon and started slapping together 6 issues of Spider-Man, put it out as a graphic novel. And I don't know if you remember at the time, but the newspapers and magazines, these headlines like, Splat Bow, comics aren't for kids anymore. Adults were reading. And for a short period, they became incredibly fashionable, incredibly trendy, that adults were actually reading graphic novels. But there just wasn't the quality material to sustain this. So it just sort of fizzled out again. But over the years, they've carried on exponentially coming out. So by now, over the last 15 years or something, there's been a whole canon of quality work, a whole range of graphic novels appeal to anybody, any sort of interest across the board, no matter what you're into, any genre, any style, whatever. So now we have this really good quality graphic novels to sustain this sort of boom that's been going on for the last 15 years. Whereas back in the 80s, there just wasn't that range.
With The Tale of One Bad Rat, this graphic novels that deal with difficult subjects that sometimes are autobiographical. They're, as you say, there's been a huge boom in the last 15 years or so. Did you set out to tell a story about child sex abuse with One Bad Rat?
Not originally, no. That was the original. Where I have written at this at length. I think I did afterward to Bad Rats. But yeah, I set out, my original idea was to do a book set in the English Lake District. That was the idea. And it was just, to cut a long story short, it was just one of these stories that you start working on. And it takes you somewhere you didn't think you were going to go. I mean, I didn't think I was going to be writing about Beatrix Potter. I knew nothing about Beatrix Potter. I had to research inside and out to do the story, because that's the way the story took me. And this child abuse thing was the same. I didn't set out to write it. It's just that I ended up, the story took me there. When you're developing a story, you do a lot of research, you start thinking about it a lot. That's it. You're just thinking about it all the time. You have to, like anything else that's good, for anything to be good, you have to obsess about it. So it means that anything you see, hear, feel, touch, see in the street and everything, you're sort of relating it to the story. So yeah, that's how Bad Rat. Well, it's all my books happen really. But yeah. To answer your question, actually, a bit fuller. Yeah, I wanted to do a book about the Lake District, and I didn't know how. I was reading books on Wordsworth and stuff like this. Didn't really grab me. And we visited, because I've been going to the Lake District for many, many years. I love the Lake District, and which is where the original idea came from, to do a story. And we visited Beatrix Potter's house, took the kids there, I think. And I didn't know her work at all. But then while I was there, I thought, well, she made a living. She wrote stories that used a mixture of words and pictures, which is what I do. So I thought, well, perhaps the book can be about Beatrix Potter. So I started researching Beatrix Potter, and by the time I'd finished, I read over a dozen books on her, which I've still got quite a few of them over there. I realised it won't make a very interesting graphic novel. It wouldn't make a very good story. I don't know if you saw the film Miss Potter that was made a few years ago. That sort of made the story interesting by just making things up. It's supposed to be a biography of it. It's made things up, to make it more interesting. So I was sort of abandoning that idea. And then, as you say, I was in Tottenham Court Road tube station, just going up the stairs, and I saw this girl begging, and she just put me in mind of the description of Beatrix Potter when she was 16, who was described as being painfully shy and tongue-tied in company. And she was there, she had this sign, "Hungry and homeless, please help." And there was this big guy trying to get her to come to some sort of hostel or something. "Jesus loves you" badges all over him. And she looked so shy. And it was afterwards I thought, puts me in mind of Beatrix Potter at her age, 16. And that's when I thought, well, perhaps she's run away from home and she's got a synchronistic link with Beatrix Potter, and she ends up going to the Lake District. Simple as that. And I thought, why should it run away from home? I thought, easy, it's been abused. Simply, it was facile as that. So then I'd start researching, child abuse, reading books on psychological aspects of child abuse, reading transcripts by abuse survivors. And I realised it couldn't be just a MacGuffin, just a reason for it. It had to be what the story was about. It couldn't be marginalised. So that's how come it ended up being about child abuse. Never intended, never set off to go there,
Your style is very different to the kind of gothic, steampunky stuff we'd seen from you in the 80s. I presume, well, I assume this was to tie it in much more to the simplicity and the colour of Potter's illustrations.
Partly. I've got Rupert the Bear was quite a big influence. But mainly because this was I realised it was the first non-genre book I'd ever done. And I realised that rather than just appealing to 1% of the population who were comic fans, superhero fans, whatever, this potentially could appeal to anybody, 100% of the population. It's a non-genre story. So I deliberately went out of my way and spent a lot of time to make it accessible to people who weren't used to reading comics. So I made the style very clear. I used this sort of lean clear style, and so it was very, very straightforward storytelling, and very, each panel you could see at a glance what was happening in that panel. The placement of the speech balloons was very deliberate, so you knew exactly which came next, and it was very, it was done with this style to make it accessible to as many people as possible, which is why there was quite a big change in between that. And also because I didn't want to make it cartoony because of the subject matter, I wanted to ground it in reality. For the first time, I actually decided to use photo rev for not all of them, but most of them. The model, the characters are based on real people who had model, not the character, but the looks. So I was looking at people, trying to find, thinking about people who he'd match that character. Okay, and I, in a lot of the cases, actually got them to pose for their appearances and took lots of pictures. And I think my solicitor at the time, he was the father, the abusive father, friend of mine. I used neighbours. I used anybody, And the thing is, it had got about a week before me having to start work on it, and I still hadn't found a model for Helen. I'd done sketches of what I wanted it to look like based on this girl I'd seen in the tube station, but I hadn't seen anybody. I didn't know anybody who looked like her. And I'd be walking around Preston doing shopping or something like that. I'd be looking at teenage girls, thinking, does she look like Helen? But I thought, well, even if I see somebody who does, I can't go up to her and say, "Oh, excuse me, would you mind coming back to my house? I'll take some pictures." So I was stuck, really. And then about a week before, it was about a week before I had to start work, I was invited to give a talk at a local Catholic college of all places on comics by the drama teacher. And I said I was looking for a model for Helen. So I finished this lecture. At the end, he had 3 of his drama students to audition for the role. And Kate Houston, who I used, she looked just like Helen I'd drawn. She had the fringe and everything, And I took about 3 or 4 reels of film. We just went outside and said, right, laugh, cry, do this, do that. And she was a good actor. I mean, she played Lady Macbeth in the school play recently. But yeah, she just pulled a lot of faces. I took them from different handles, and I used those for the basis for Helen. And the funny thing is, I'd done sketches of this character as well. I'd not found a character for he was supposed to be like a heavy metal type with long curly hair. I did a drawing of him, glasses, heavy metal t-shirt, leather jacket, And I'm talking to Kate in the corridor, and this guy walks past. And I said, "Excuse me." And he hadn't been to the talk. He was just another student in the sixth form college. And I said, "Will you post some pictures for me outside here?" And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, look," and I pulled the script out of a bag, and I said, "Read the description of this character here." And the character's name is actually Ben. And he read the description, and you could see how much it was like him, the exact description of him. And he said, yeah, I'll post it. He said, "My name's Ben." And I'd actually invented this guy.
I think Alan Moore tells an anecdote about that, where he was in a pub and John Constantine walked in at one point. I always loved it.
It was a cafe in London, actually, yeah. And the sequel to that, because he was sitting in a cafe, and this guy like John Constantine with a fag and everything walks around the corner, and he goes, "I'm not going to check out that, I don't go there," and he left the cafe. Well, a couple of years later, when Jamie Delano was writing Hellblazer, he actually visited the British Museum to do a bit of research. And as he was leaving, this guy who looked like Sting, wearing a trench coat, fag out of his mouth, come walking across, winked at him, put the cigarette out, and went inside. And Jim was going, same guy, it must be the same guy, I don't know.
One of the, it's a terrifying thought that there are kind of comics creators bringing their characters to life in the real world, to be quite frank. With Tale of One Bad Rat, was this the point at which you felt that you were finally at a stage, having got it published, that you had made the move into being a graphic novelist as opposed to a work for hire?
No, no, because I did some Sandman stories about the time. In fact, I think I even did work on a Sandman story while I was working on Bad Rat, because they asked me to step in at the last minute to do 8 to 10 pages, something like that. Might have been 16 pages actually. If I could do these in 10 days, because Colleen Doran, who was actually drawing it, she had some sort of physical breakdown because she was working that hard, and they needed somebody to do this work fast. But I think when I was doing Bad Rat, I also did the framing sequences for World's End, which was a Sandman story. And then after that, I did some work for Techno Comics for a couple of years, probably 3 or 4 years. Drew Technophage, written by Rick Veitch. And then I actually wrote one. I wrote Shadow Death, which was illustrated by Dave Pugh, who also used to do work for 2000 AD. So I think that wasn't the last time. No, because after that I did Heart of Empire, which was a sequel to Luther Arkwright. But after that, I did a 4-part series for DC called Dead Boy Detectives, written by Ed Brubaker. And shortly after that, I did they asked me to do an issue of Fables by Bill Wilmington. But I think that's the last commercial work as such I did. I did about the same time. I did a strip for 2000 AD Annual called Memento, full colour, 12-page strip I wrote and drew. But I do things occasionally now and again. But since then, I've mainly concentrated on my own work. I've done about a dozen or so graphic novels since then.
But the reason I asked is because Alice in Sunderland, which was the next big graphic novel that you did, didn't come out until 2007.
About 4 or 5 years of work.
So it's for me, it's interesting to see the kind of, not stops and starts, but the way that your career is clearly heading towards a point that you'd like to be doing your own thing. It just takes a long time. It's almost as if publishing has to come around to your idea of where we need to be. Is it something that's as time has gone on, even with all the commercial work you've been doing, it's always there? You're always thinking of ideas for...
Yeah. I think we were cut off before when I was talking about this, but you're asking about something about along these lines. And it was in the early 80s. I went to the Luca Festival. I was invited as a guest to the Luca Comic Festival, where I'd met these. It's funny because I was broke at the time. I was on the point of leaving comic. I thought, I'm not making a living here. I'm going to have to do something else. And I got invited there to represent the British Underground, because I'd done these underground comics, along with, I think, the other guests. They included Dave Gibbons and Arthur Ranson, and we did Button Man. And we were there and I'm, feeling broke and feeling complete failure at comics. But suddenly I'm in the company of Hugo Pratt, Milo Manara, I should say, Mobius, people like that, who treated me like I'm a colleague, like I'm an equal. And I was discovering these fantastic European albums, brilliant things, and hearing about them and how the artists keep control over their characters. They don't work for other people. They don't work on, other people's characters, but they create their own characters and they own them, and they belong to them. And I really like the idea of that, and that's one of the reasons that I still do graphic novels. And I got drawn towards doing graphic novels, apart from liking the form of comics in a book. The fact that I actually own anything and own everything, and if anything actually happened, the character can't go off and out alive without me. Nobody else can start drawing it unless I give them permission. But also, if something happened, like a TV series or a film or something, I'd have the benefit of it, not the publisher. I know for the past 4 years, there's people been trying to get a big production company trying to get a Grandville TV series made. They've still not managed to attach a director. I don't know if they'll continue with it now, especially after this everything be on hold at the moment. But yeah, they've got the scripts been written by a Doctor Who writer. I think the whole 8-issue first series is plotted and the pilot issue is scripted. But the drama has been so big recently. All the big name directors, because they want a top director, they wanted it to be a top of the range TV thing. All the top directors are busy, they're all booked up for several years, so they've had a lot of trouble finding a director for it. In the past, there's been attempts for Arkwright TV series to be made and things like this, but if anything ever happened, I'd get the benefit of it. I mean, meanwhile, it's still some extra income for me because I'm getting paid every year while they're, they've got the option for the book. So, I mean, any form of income keeps you going, because while you're working on a graphic novel, there's no money coming in. With this Arkwright book I'm working on now, I got paid in advance when I started, but it's going to take me 2 years. It's going to be 2 or 3. I only get the next bit of it, the advance, when it's finished. So that means for all year or two, I'm not actually earning anything. So these sort of royalties and things coming in from other, it helps to support me while I'm going. I mean, I still get royalties twice a year off Sandman, because that was a big seller.
Do you think that creates a block in the industry for people who don't have an established reputation but want to produce original graphic novels?
Yes, because you need money coming in, unless you're doing it all in spare time. And as I said, it's a long slog anyway if you're doing it full time. And I work 7 days a week, so it's taken me all this time to build up to a point where I'm getting this money coming in regularly, which enables me to do it. But also, I mean, through my website, I sell artwork, that's a good another source of income. A bit of, another percentage of income that comes in every year. So it's a balancing act, really.
And it that consideration of the fact you've got to have money coming in, I guess that informs quite often your creative choices in terms of the projects you can work on. Because I mean, you mentioned that Alice in Sunderland was 4 or 5 years of work.
Yeah, and I did it all up front as well. I couldn't find a publisher for it because it was very hard to sell, because I couldn't say to anybody, well, it's like this, it's like that, because there was nothing else it was like. And I even did a few sample pages, so I could show people, and they still couldn't get it. And I had a meeting with Dan Franklin at Jonathan Cape, who'd started doing graphic novels. They've been doing graphic novels for 2 or 3 years. And I showed him these sample pages and he read it and he said, I can't see it. He said, I just can't see it. So I thought, well, it's either shelved the whole thing. And I actually written it all, which took 12 weeks to structure it, because it's an extremely elaborate structure, it's on the surface, it's all stream of consciousness, but it's actually got a rock solid structure underneath where every little bit of information is introduced at exactly the right time that the reader needs to understand the bits that are coming up and coming next. And I'd scripted it all. So I thought, well, it's either put it to one side of, if I did that, shelved it, I know all the ideas I'd had, I'm holding in my head for it and just go, I'd be thinking about something else. So, but fortunately at the time, Mary was still working as a university lecturer. She was a reader at Sunderland University, which is how I ended up here. And so she could support me while I was doing it. And then after I'd finished it all, I had another meeting with Dan Franklin. And it's one of my claims to fame that my editor is the same editor as Salman Rushdie's editor. I went down and had a meeting with him, and I showed him the whole thing in 3 folders. This is before I had an iPad or anything. 3 big fat folders, weighed a ton. And he sat there and looked through it all, and he said, I like it. I like what it looks like, but I need to read the script first. I need to read it all. So I got back to Sunderland and went to Pronto Print and had them make me up a black and white collection copy, bound of the whole thing, sent him that. I had to wait about 6 weeks. And eventually he got back to it. Yes, I love it. I'm going to do it. And it was a big success for them. It was a big seller as graphic novels go in Britain. It went into fourth, fifth edition within the first year. They had to reprint it. America did the Dark Horse did the American one. So I've been working for Cape since. All the books I've done since have been for Cape.
It must be a great sense of vindication in that kind of
thing. So I've been very lucky. They've not turned down. I still have to send them a proposal for each book, but they've not turned any down since then. And after they reprinted Bad Rat, of course. Again, they did a reprint of it, and I'd done Grandville, and then Mary took early retirement from academia. She was getting really sick of all the. I mean, it's imagine it's a lot worse now, but they were cutting costs, and she was having to do more and more work for the same money. And they'd fire somebody, and the rest of the staff would have to split all the work in between them. It was getting really too much, and she decided to take early retirement. And so one night, shortly after this, we're sitting around, and I said, "Hey, why don't you have a glass of wine or two?" And I said, "Hey, why don't you write a graphic novel and I'll draw it?" And he said, "Yeah, really?" And I said, "Yeah, you've read comics, you've read my stuff, you've read graphic novels. I've shown you." When they said, "Oh, read this is good," and the upshot is she did do, and it became the only British graphic novel to win a major literary award. It won Daughter of a Father's Eyes, won the Costa Biography Award, and it was massive. It was we were on Channel 4 News, we were on Radio 4, we were on all over the place, and it was incredible. Bit of for us, and the since then I've continued to work on her books, but I've been doing them, doing one of my books and doing one of hers, then one of mine again.
From Tale of One Bad Rat through Alice in Sunderland, Daughter of Father's Eyes, Sally Heathcote, Suffragette, which is also a Jonathan Cape book. There's always that engagement with the past, whether it's the literature of the past or people from the past. And for me, that chimes nicely with the kind of the themes you were playing with in Luther Arkwright, which was engaging with not just the aesthetics, but the personalities of the past. Is that something that you enjoy doing the research? You enjoy getting your teeth into these people and producing a work that riffs off their legacy?
Yes, but I mean, it's Mary who's done the research for her books. I mean, I have to do a lot of research for the visual side of it, for the costumes and street scenes and vehicles and things like that. But yeah, I've always been into history, and not in an academic way, but in a sort of the stories of history, the storytelling way. And actually, the last book I did with Mary was Rain, which came out last October. And that's set in present day. It's not a historical book at all. It's about ecological issues.
I'm also really curious about the kind of bookends of Tale of One Bad Rat and Alice in Sunderland, because Alice in Sunderland it has a major component which is about local history, about the story, as you say, the stories that are generated around a place. And your work always seems to have a real sense of place, a sense of location, like connecting with not just a place in terms of the locality, but the stories we tell about it, the way we feel about it, the way we represent it. Whether it was the lakes that you had a connection with, that you've always enjoyed going there, or whether it's the local history of Alice in Sunderland. Do you feel that as a creator that you have a kind of almost psychogeographical need to tell stories that have a grounding in an actual physical place, in an actual physical location?
I'm not sure, because I mean, some of the parallel worlds, especially this new Luther Arkwright book, Once you come to think of it, you're right. There are parallels, but there's one in like an alternative version of Yorkshire, and well, it's very different. It's like a medieval sort of version of Yorkshire. But yeah, yes, you're probably right. Rather than in a fantasy world, I do have this idea for this fantasy story that I first came up with about 25 years ago, and I've actually plotted it all. I've got a full folder of notes on it, and I've never got around to doing it. And the big appeal to that was it would require no research. It would be done in a very cartoony style, quite a cartoony style, but everything would be made up. The house would be made up, the location would be made up, everything would be made up, the costumes, everything. I could just get on with it. I've never managed to get around to actually doing it yet.
Yeah, that does sound like the product of an imagination that's kind of like, can I not have to read a dozen books in order to do it?
I mean, even with Grandville, I was reading books on historical Paris and the Belle Epoque, things like that.
I'm interested in because now you're very clearly a graphic novelist. It's what you do. You're working with Mary on her writing. Graphic novel is one of those terms which almost every time we use it, there's an argument. People. There are people who argue that comics is comics. You don't need to invent a term in order to explain it to a different audience. But with your stuff, it is very novelistic. You look at term.
I don't like the term graphic novel. I mean, I never liked the term. It's just that, but you can use it now. People know what you're talking about. Because I think people get mixed up a bit. I mean, comics is the actual medium. What I do is comics. Graphic novel just means comics in book form. It's a marketing term. And as I said, a lot of so-called graphic novels aren't novels at all. They're reportage, a biography, or something like that. They're not novels. Some of them are anthologies with lots of different stories. But it's a title for the form that's sold in. I mean, there's even this ludicrous subgenre, which is non-fiction graphic novels. It's a marketing subgenre. But yeah, I don't like it because it has a graphic novel. Graphic has connotations of explicit sex or violence, or on the other hand, with commercial art, novel. Like I said, a lot of them aren't novels. I mean, something like early graphic novels like The Killing Joke weren't really a novel. They were more like a novella or something, or a short story. So yeah, it's a very inadequate description, but until somebody can come up with a better term to describe them, I think we're stuck with it. And it's I've heard a lot of people saying that, don't call it a graphic novel, it's a comic. It is a comic, yeah, but it's a comic in book form, which makes a graphic novel. It's just the way you describe it. And it's amazing now because people who don't read comics, if you say graphic novel, they'll know what you mean. Whereas having to try and explain to comic in book form and everything, it's much easier to use the term graphic novel.
It's always fascinated me that it is a term that the world outside of comics has had to apply to comics to make them palatable in one way or form, to try and describe a medium which, particularly in Britain, so many people struggle with. And it's interesting, you talk about the European style and the European style of publishing, which over there, comics are comics. They don't necessarily need to refer to them as...
They refer to them as albums.
Exactly.
Albums.
Which is a purely...
Bande dessinée. Yeah, she's like strip drawing, it means.
Yeah, it's what I find fascinating about your career is that you are unmistakably a British creator. You've developed your own style. You develop your own. You help develop a genre. Let's face it, with the steampunk stuff, and your career is unique. There's nobody who's that I'm aware of that has really followed the same path as you.
Not quite, no.
From underground comics into mainstream comics and then forging your own path as an artist writer. Do you have a sense of that? Do you have a sense of that you have done what you've intended to, or has there been a bit more chaos to it, a bit more good fortune, I guess?
Yes, I mean, as I said before, very often I've ended up doing something just because I've been asked to do it, a lot of the commercial work. But yeah, I've always sort of aimed at doing this. But I imagine everybody thinks they've done what they want to do, they've done it their way, I don't think that's any different.
How do you work now? Because you're are you fully digital now?
No, I still I like the sort of tactile feel with the drawing on paper, drawing on drawing board. I find it a lot easier as well, than drawing on a tablet. I do colouring on this and lettering on computer, but yeah, I draw it on the drawing board over there, pencil it, ink it, rub the pencils out, scan it here, and then very often I clean it up a bit on computer. But as I said, I make a bit of a living every year by selling originals. So I know now people like Sean Phillips, people say, I love a page from Criminal. Everything's a tough look, I've not got any, they're all on computer. I think Brian Bolland was one of the first people to start fully working on computer years ago. When it used to take forever to do anything on computer.
Now that you're at a stage where something like Grandville is coming to an end, you're looking at Luther Arkwright. Do you get a sense of your career having come to a degree of full circle, or are there more things that you want to do that you have in your mind, like the idea that requires no research?
Yes, I might do that fantasy story at some point. Yeah, I mean, Mary's already scripting the fifth book, which I'll be drawing if it's accepted. I think it will be. It's another biography, and there's a couple of other stories that I might do. Instead of finished with Grandville, but I don't know if you read the last one. We had a character called Stanford Hawksmoor, who's LeBrock's mentor. Because you have the backstory, you have the story about how he trained LeBrock up to be a detective. And he's definitely a riff on Sherlock Holmes. He's got the Deerstalker, he's an Edel, Deerstalker pipe. And I'm thinking it might be fun to do a Stanford Hawksmoor story set during the French occupation, set in the past, in a different style. But it'll be, classic bit of detective fiction in a way. So I may do that. I've made a lot of notes about it, so good ideas for stories. But yeah, you were talking about the European market, especially the French markets. I mean, some of your listeners may not know how big the market there is. It's massive. If I was a French artist with the same status I'm in Britain, I'd be a millionaire, in France. Okay, but I mean, I was coming back from Angoulême once, and used to break it up by having a night in Paris. And Angoulême, they get 250,000 people there every year. One of the biggest comic convention in Europe. I'm in a bar in Paris, started talking to the waiter, and he says, what are you over here for, tourists and everything? I said, I've been to the Angoulême Festival. And he said, the comic festival. I mean, it's for a start off. I mean, you'd say, you'd mention a comic festival in Britain, nobody know about it. In France, every year at Angoulême, one of the major, Libération, one of the major newspapers, has an Angoulême pullout supplement every year. This is a national newspaper, And he said, you've been to the comic festival? He said, I'm not into comics. No, not. I don't really read them. He said, Lucky Luke, I've got all those. I've got Blueberries. Yeah, I've got a complete set of Blueberries. And then they listed all these graphic novels. He's got a complete set of, Thorgal. Oh, Thorgal's great. Yeah, but I don't really read them, usually. He had a ton of them. But I asked, about 3 years ago, I asked Nick Landau, if he could estimate how many graphic novels he thinks sold in Britain every year, you know, whether the reprints of superhero stories or original graphic novels or what, how many thoughts. And he said, let me have a think. And he estimated, and eventually he said, I think at the most, in the British Isles every year, there's something like in between 2 and 3 million graphic novels sold. Have you any idea, can you guess how many were sold in France in the same year?
Well, probably 10 times that much at least.
43 million. Yeah, one in eight books in France sold as a graphic novel. It's a huge market, and that's I'm hoping it'll be like over here at some point. But as I said, yeah, in 1980, the future is a graphic novel.
Well, one thing I do really want to talk to you about is your role as an educator and somebody who has made introductions that have brought people in the industry and talked to me, because we had Carl Critchlow on the show a few weeks ago, and he talked about meeting you and the introductions you were able to make and the advice that you gave and everything.
I mean, that's when I was actually teaching graphic design part-time in Preston,
Did
he tell you I got him to draw his first Thrud strip about 4 times? I got him to redraw it 4 times.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, sorry.
No, it's fascinating, because I mean, I think the first time I ever met you was you did a talk at Rochdale Library, and I was friends with Smuz, from the old 2000 AD artist, and he introduced us. But it seems that all the way through your career, whether you were attending like SSI meetings or you know, doing talks and everything, you've been very much a proselytizer for comics.
Yes.
And that I just wanted to understand a little bit about why, because there's so many people who they just work in comics. That's their job and they do it. But you take it one step further and you talk about and examine the medium as a way of evangelizing for it. I'm really interested about your motivation for doing that.
I don't know. It's just to get the word out about comics. I mean, I have about 3 or 4, I think, perhaps more, I don't know, but PowerPoint presentations that I can do. You know, one of which is how I create a graphic novel from, you know, idea, loose concepts, all the way through to finished thing. I do another one, as I said before, on the history of anthropomorphic comics. Yeah, I've done teaching now and again. I taught a 5-day course in Brazil once, about 20 years ago, on comics, so I had to do everything. And for about 10 years, I did 5-day residential course for the Avon Foundation on creative writing for graphic novels. Yeah, it's something. Then again, you know, it's those things. I didn't instigate them. I was asked if I'd do them, you know, and I went, yeah, sure, I'll do them. But yeah, every time I had a book out since Bad Rat, I think. Yeah, since Bad Rat, I've actually done a talk about it. So I can actually promote the book by doing a talk, which usually involves talking about his comics in general.
I'm interested to understand what it is about comics. Obviously, your career has been in comics, graphic novels, etc. What do you think is actually the value of comic books as a medium?
It's a medium like any other. I mean, it all depends on what you do with it. You know, I don't know. Would you say to somebody, you know, you make films, what's the value of films?
I have asked that question in the interview.
Really? All right, fair enough then. I think it's you either like them or you don't. But I mean, it's wrong to ascribe any one genre to a comic. It's just a medium that's completely open. And I think the important thing is what's necessary to like them is what's fundamental is you have to have a love of illustration. You have to like looking at drawings. So if you like illustration anyway, with comics, there's lots of illustrations. And they're not just on their own. They're not just illustrations on their own. They're doing more than that. They're actually coming together to tell a story. And then you have words that come into that as well. And somehow it's more than a sum of the parts. So you're getting the enjoyment of looking at the illustrations, you're getting the enjoyment of the story. And there's a sort of strange sort of alchemy happens in your head while you're reading comics. They sort of come together, the words of the pictures. It goes in through two channels. It goes in through the words and the pictures, and they come together to form something new in your mind. It's what I've heard academics talking about comics describe as multiple literacy. It's and some people have to actually learn how to read comics, which is strange by me. I don't remember having to have to do that. I mean, it's not rocket science, you know. I mean, I'm sure anybody with after 4 or 5 pages they get the hang of it. But it does something unique. There's something unique about comics. And it's actually, I mean, a lot of people make the comparison to film because there's, close-ups and panning shots and zoom-ins and things like that. The thing a lot of people don't realise is every single one of those originated in comics. They're actually done in comics first. They were done in comics form first, before they were in films. And I think because comics are an expression of an artist, I mean, especially if it's all done by one person, it's filtered through the imagination, perception of the person who creates it. I find that way comics are actually closer to prose fiction than movies. You know what I mean? Because they're sort of an expression of somebody's imagination rather than like a huge team effort like a movie.
I was reading a paper recently about that mentioned about the connections people make between film and comics, and how film can be a passive medium. You know, you can sit there and it feeds you, it does the work for you.
You can fall asleep, it'll still go on, you know.
Exactly. But with comics, as you say, it's much closer to prose in that you are the one who is instigating and engaging in an activity. You are forcing time onto something that is flat on the page. You know, the speed at which you read it, the manner in which you read it, taking in information is actually very it's not passive. It's
more
active.
demanding than film. Yeah, it is. And of course you touched on something there. The writer and the artist of a comic can actually dictate the speed of the reading to the reader. There's lots of ways you can do it, whether it's use of compositional lines or the amount of text you use, the amount in a panel, the amount of detail you put in a panel, because that slows reading down. There's all sorts of ways of speeding up, controlling how you read comics, including the number of panels you split a moment in time up into. You know, you can in Luther Arkwright, there's one bit where I have 6 seconds stretched over 72 panels. So there's various ways of manipulating the reader's perception of time in the story in comics.
Looking at the work you've done, particularly with your graphic novels, I'm keen to find out what you feel you've learned, not just not in terms of like, you know, just where to put lines on the page and things like that, but what you've learned as a person from doing this, about your craft and about yourself doing these big projects where it's just you.
I don't know. It's very hard to step outside, isn't it? It's just something I do. But yeah, you've got patience. I think you have to have. You just have to, because these things take a long time. You just have to. You know, it's the idea is like 1% inspiration and doing the work's the 99 perspiration. You know, you just have to get on with it. And it's immensely satisfying. It's the very satisfying things to do. They're only satisfying when they're actually finished. You can go, there it is. That's the book. That's the satisfying bit. I don't know. It's, I mean, from my point of view, it's a nice living to have. It's a nice thing to do. I mean, I have in the past worked in jobs where very early on, I worked at British Aerospace for 6 months at one point. we have to get up in the middle of winter at 6 a.m. and travel an hour to get into work through snow, and then work an hour and a half overtime and get back late, and it's a nightmare. And here I am, usually at home. I don't have anybody looking over my shoulder. I've not got a boss telling me what to do. It's I'm my own boss. But that is a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because that's the worst thing about being self-employed, is the boss is a bastard. But yeah, the discipline that you do get, you're giving to yourself. And I'm not completely disciplined. I get up in the morning, faff about doing email, look at the news, stuff like that before I start working.
Has your viewpoint changed? Because I particularly when thinking about the kind of left-wing anti-authoritarianism of your work when you were on Luther Arkwright and your underground work and that kind of counterculture stuff. Over the last 40 years, the Overton window was moved. Society is different, attitudes are different. How much are you still the person who was doing underground comics, Brainstorm and Luther Arkwright? How much has your viewpoint evolved or matured over that period?
I think it's matured a lot. I mean, in those days I was stoned most of the time, so not that in common with Alan. I don't know. I mean, I'm more. The older you get, you grow more knowledgeable about various things. You get more to be an expert on this, that, and the other. I think I'm probably more political now than I was then. Especially the way the world's been going for the last 15 years. I don't perhaps say it anymore without going into politics, start ranting about politics.
No, I mean it's interesting that you say your work is more political now. It's because you look at some figures from the 1970s and they haven't necessarily changed. They've just kind of doubled down on the anger of the time. Whereas I think it's interesting that you look at the work you're producing now, and the politics is more subtle. Let's put it that way. But it's still there. It's engaging with a much wider kind of band of political thought than necessarily it was in the 1970s.
I suppose so. You've not seen the new Luther Arkwright yet, though. So.
Super. And many thanks to Bryan for being so generous with his time. Hope you enjoyed that, Earthlets. It's really interesting to get Bryan's perspective on an industry, a career that has not just been in the industry but has contributed towards defining the industry. We're going to be back in a week's time. Again, do let us know if there's anything or anyone you'd like us to feature in the future. But until then, please take care of yourselves and splendid Vethrig.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000ADonline.com.